Everybody. So real quick, just a few things to review regarding survey design. So what is a survey? A survey is a type of research where the investigator asks questions of a respondent. So it can have different purposes. Some of the main reasons why people use surveys is to obtain political information, to do marketing, to establish employee satisfaction. And it's commonly used to predict decisions or behaviors. So, for example, how a population is expected to vote. Its common uses are to assess beliefs or opinions. So, a couple of examples. Should public schools receive more federal funding? Would you recommend this online store to a friend? How would you evaluate your instructor? Demographics could include what's your age, what's your religious affiliation, and then behaviors, usually retrospective. How many minutes did you exercise last week? How many hours of television did you watch in the last month? And I'm sure if you use the internet, like we all do, you've probably seen examples of surveys used in marketing. And this is kind of an example of a survey that comes up on YouTube. And it's kind of funny because it asks about streaming sites, including YouTube and YouTube Music, which are both, the ad was on YouTube, which is kind of funny. But it's asking about which streaming sites the person has heard of. So a census versus a survey. So a census is different than a survey in that it targets the entire population of interest with the goal of including everyone. So in the United States, census information is used for congressional representation, so making sure that there's enough representatives to represent the population in a specific geographic area. It can also provide data to inform services. So if there need to be more, community mental health centers or food banks, things like that. A survey, on the other hand, uses a sample. So like we talked about before, a sample is a small subset of the population. There are different types of surveys or different formats that surveys can be administered. So through the mail or through USPS. Pros and cons, it saves time, but often there's too many steps to ensure follow through. So if, is a person going to open the envelope? Are they going to read the instructions? Are they going to fill out the survey? Are they going to put it back in the envelope? And are they going to mail it back? Do they have stamps? A lot of us don't have stamps anymore because we do a lot of things electronically. So response rates tend to be lower with mail surveys. Telephone surveys, these save time, but it's difficult to reach certain people of interest. So some people have unlisted numbers, some people screen their calls. I'm sure you can think of, or I don't know if you would be able to think of the last time you answered a call from a number you did not recognize. I know personally I don't, just because of spam. I prefer that the person leaves a message, and I think a lot of times that can impact response rates. So the internet, we've talked about this in previous weeks. Internet is easy, it's cost effective, but as we talked about before, it's more likely to get a biased sample. So younger age, maybe even socioeconomic status. So people that have regular, reliable internet access and the spare time to do a survey on the internet. In-person surveys can be time consuming and expensive. Researchers have to travel, participants have to travel to a place to meet and do the survey. But it can help gather more in-depth information to have the participants sitting across the table from you and get more context on their answers. And then there's something called focus groups. So these are groups of people that volunteer to sit around a table and they answer questions. This allows a researcher to get a lot of information at once, but it can be hard to facilitate. Not everyone's good at facilitating group discussion or handling if like an argument starts breaking out, things like that. So in surveys, there's different types of questions. So we have open-ended questions. So for example, this could be, Describe situations wherein you consume alcohol. So this would allow for more context, so the person can kind of explain the context in which they might drink alcohol. But for the researcher, it can be harder to quantify the information. People have different ways of wording things. They might use different language, slang, different vernacular. And then the responses could vary in quality as well. Maybe they don't actually answer the question. A close-ended question could be, for example, how many times per week do you consume alcohol? And then the person would receive multiple choice options. So this provides less context, but it's easier to count up the data and quantify the data. So when we talk about survey research, we're relying on self-report and oftentimes memory. So there's some problems with this. So first, it's less reliable. We see that people tend to over-report events by memory. We have something called telescoping memory bias. This is a phenomenon in which recent events are perceived as being more remote and distant events are perceived as being more recent. So if you can imagine, for example, when was the last time that you called your grandparents or parents? You might say that this was more recent than it actually was. And then the strategies that people use to recall recent versus distant information is variable. So if we ask two different questions here, has anything stressful happened to you in the last week versus has anything stressful happened to you in the last year? People in the last week are going to say things like, oh, I was late for work. I forgot to turn in an assignment. Um, I didn't get much sleep on Wednesday night and, didn't do as well on an assignment or what have you. Regarding we're talking about the last year, this might involve things like major illness or a death of a family member or financial struggles, like larger, more impactful life events rather than kind of daily, day-to-day events. So in terms of questions that assess attitude, so there's some issues with these kinds of questions as well. So there's the idea of pre-existing versus research-created attitudes. So this is when a participant does not necessarily have an opinion or a position on a topic, but essentially they kind of create an opinion after reading the research question. So it could be something they've never thought about before until they're asked on a survey. So for example, do you agree with the president's position on internet neutrality? Probably not something a lot of people think about on a regular basis or have an opinion about, or even know what the president's stance is on internet neutrality. So in this case, people are going to be apprehensive to say that they're neutral, maybe because they don't want to look ignorant. And so they might use existing data. So maybe they say, hey, I don't really like the president, so I probably don't agree with their position on internet neutrality. Or, yeah, I totally love the president. I definitely agree with their position on most things, probably also internet neutrality. So this can impact the way that people answer questions and also the quality of data because it's not a true opinion of the respondent. We should also consider question wording. So how we word questions is going to impact how a participant responds. And this might seem like common sense. So if we ask for opinions about Obamacare versus the Affordable Care Act, the term Obamacare might have more emotions or more associations behind it. So for example, if someone was not a supporter of the Obama administration and hears the term Obamacare, they might have certain biases that they approach the question versus if we use the term Affordable Care Act. And there's three types of problematic questions. So there's a double barrel question. This is when two different issues are asked about in the same question. So for example, should South Carolina increase funding to public education and healthcare? Well, if someone answers yes to that, then what if they have a different opinion on public education or healthcare? What if they think that one of them does not need more funding? Then we have negative wording. So for example, professors should not be required to notify administration if a student is failing. Agree or disagree? So this would be like a double negative. And this is especially problematic for people who do not speak English as their first language, or who, have maybe their lower intellectual functioning. So this can also impact the accuracy of the information that you're getting from those populations. And it can be confusing if someone's reading the question fast. And then we have loaded questions. So these are questions that use language that tends to evoke emotions. So for example, do you agree with eliminating wasteful excesses in the state budget? Well, most people would probably agree with eliminating wasteful excesses because of the way that it's worded. So then we have response bias. So this is a tendency for a participant to respond in predictable ways, regardless of a question's content. So there's different ways that this can happen. There's a phenomenon called social desirability. So this is the tendency to answer in a way that makes somebody look good. This is also called positive impression management, which you might have heard before. Basically, just responding in a way that makes someone appear favorable. Then we have acquiescence. This is a tendency to respond affirmatively to questions. So, tendency to say they agree with things, a tendency to say true, a tendency to say yes, regardless of what the question says. And they could even contradict themselves by responding yes to two questions that ask the opposite thing. And then we have satisficing. This is a tendency to respond to the first reasonably acceptable response, but not necessarily the best response. And that is it for our lecture on survey methods. There'll be a couple of questions on the quiz about this as well. All right, thanks everybody.